really care about the Ukrainian people like you claim you do, then listen to me very carefully. My name is Lucas Gage. I served 2 tours in Iraq. I put it in quotes because who did I serve? The special interest who wanted war. How did they get that war? They lied to us. They said Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and he was tied to 9/11. Both lies, and we all know it now. Years later, of course, after all the damage has been done. The same, I believe, is happening with the Ukrainians. The EU, NATO, the US, they don't give a damn about Ukraine. They're using it as a bulwark against Russia because they have an agenda to take out Vladimir Putin. And they're saying, look, the Ukrainians are winning the war. They're pushing here and they're pushing there. That's when Putin has his hands tied behind his back in a special operation, which is limited in nature. But now that he's annexed these regions, whether you agree with it or not, Putin can unleash the full military might of Russia. And the Ukrainians have no chance whatsoever. And that's the lie the media is telling you, that they do have a chance. They don't. In fact, the only way Ukraine has a chance against Russia is if they drag us all into the war with them. And you know what that means? World War III. And you know what else? Unlike Saddam, who didn't have weapons of mass destruction, Russia does. And if they're used, it's not good for anybody, especially the Ukrainians, because who do you think are going to be hit first? So if you really care about the Ukrainians, stop filling their heads up with fantasies. Stop believing the obvious lies of the West. My God, the U.S. just threw Ukraine under the bus about this assassination of Dugina. What do you think, they care? They don't care about the Ukrainians. The EU doesn't care, NATO doesn't care, and the United States most certainly doesn't care about Ukraine or anyone else for that matter. The only thing these people care about, these traitors and globalists at the top, are war, profits, and control. That's all they care about. Don't fall for the lies. If you truly care about the Ukrainians and the Russians, especially the civilians, you want to talk peace right now. Let's push for peace.
The context that you have on the ground as well, that Putin is losing the ground war and losing the war in the court of public opinion domestically.
Yeah, I mean, Russia is losing this war right now. Putin is losing this war right now. And as he loses, he becomes more desperate. He becomes more isolated. If you're Ukraine, or if you're one of the countries that's arrayed against Putin, well, that's good news. That's a good thing. But it also means that we're entering a new phase where Putin is likely to be less predictable as he becomes more, cornered.
About this is Steve Hall, CNN intelligence analyst and former national security analyst, former CIA chief of Russia operations. Steve, great to see you here. A third of its military strength, the UK says Russia's lost. What do you make of that?
To put it in the most simple terms, it continues to go very poorly for Russia in Ukraine, and especially along these areas that they really hope to be able to control. Now, we've already seen, you recall the previous chapter, where the Russians, at first said, we're going to take it all, and we're going to end up in Kyiv and other places in the West. They've clearly abandoned that. They decided to refocus on the East and on the Southeast, and now it's going badly for them as well. As a matter of fact, the Russians are now saying, well, it might not be both Luhansk and Donetsk that we can take. It might just be part of that Donbas region. So it keeps getting dialed back further and further.
It really is interesting. When the Russians lost here, they lost here, they lost here, and now in Kharkiv, they've been pushed back substantially. And we have this new video I can show you right here in the big wall here of Ukrainian forces. They're at the border, they say, in this picture. The Russian border, Ukrainian-Russian border, saying, Mr. President, to President Zelensky, we're here. We've made it all the way.
The enemy is continuously hitting our positions with all types of artillery, mortars and tanks. Our servicemen fight back with dignity. The enemy suffers heavy losses but continues to attack. Serhiy Cherevati, spokesperson of the Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on the air of the national telethon. Here their main approach is not to spare the personnel. They call them single-use. They brought them in showed the direction, sent to the offensive, then they were killed. After dinner, they sent the next ones. Stupid, linear, scorched earth tactics. Head on until the last soldier. Ruslan Shevchuk, colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, commander of the 93rd Independent Holodny Yar Mechanized Brigade, in an interview with Suspilne News.
It's been amazing what the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people have done so far. And even though outnumbered, seemingly it is more than evenly balanced because of the continued incompetence of the Russian army, mostly army, but Russian armed forces, which has been, from my perspective, somewhat stunning. I think as I look at this, this is from my interactions with my European friends. Europe thinks this is existential. They think Putin's existential. And I think Sweden and Finland joining NATO so quickly, or poised to do so, is just an example of that. I do believe that Putin still wants all of Ukraine, and he will continue to fight accordingly. I think he's a little bit out of touch in terms of what's going on the ground, and out of touch on how badly his forces have performed. But they're better now than they were early, and unconstrained and unopposed, he'll try to take all of Ukraine. This is a long slog of a fight for Putin in particular to gain his objectives, and I think he has to be stopped. I don't think he's going to stop. I think he has to be forced to settle with respect to how this comes out, and we, our allies, NATO, United States in particular, have to keep providing the kind of arms we have at a rate that will allow the Ukrainians to continue to oppose and sustain the kind of counteroffensive that you're talking about. The spirit is there, the will to fight is there. They have to have that capability.
It is significant, but it's also desperate. He is losing. And the battlefield reality he faces is, I think, irreversible. In other words, over the last 7 months, President Zelensky and Ukraine have mobilized vastly better than has Russia. In other words, Ukraine has recruited, trained, equipped, organized, and employed forces incomparably better than Russia has. And the reality facing Russia now is that Ukraine, a country a third the size of Russia, has a bigger, much more effective army on the ground and other assets as well. All of this, of course, supported by the arsenal of democracy of the United States, now up to $17 billion, over another billion announced this week, in military arms, ammunition, and materiel, and also supported by the other NATO countries and other Western countries around the world. So he faces a situation that I think, again, is irreversible. There's no amount of shambolic mobilization, which is the only way to describe it, no amount of annexation, no amount of even veiled nuclear threats can actually get him out of this particular situation.
If you think about HIMARS, what's happening now, the offensives that are moving from Kherson, and I think Kherson's probably going to fall in the next 3 or 4 weeks, and then the other wing of the counteroffensive that's coming down south towards Donetsk. Both of these are headed towards Crimea, so we would say all roads lead towards Crimea. And once they get HIMARS in range of the Russian bases inside Crimea, then I think it's just math after that.
My word. Can I ask you first about Russia's accusation that the Royal Navy attacked the Nord Stream underwater gas pipeline, and talking about retaliation. The Kremlin is calling this an act of terrorism. We're used to, inflated and false claims from the Kremlin. What do you make of this?
But this is another one of those inflated false claims. It's like the whining that comes out of the Kremlin is incredible for a world superpower, the amount of whining about all manner of things, and they're shooting in every different direction in order to distract or confuse us, almost to numb us to all of these various false claims.
Is Russia winning? Jake, let's not confuse the tactical with strategic. When it comes to Putin's strategic objectives, he's already failed. His strategic objective was to end Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, to erase it from the map, to subsume it in Russia. That has failed. And a sovereign, independent Ukraine is going to be around a lot longer than Vladimir Putin's on the scene. Meanwhile, there is a tactical, ferocious battle going on in eastern Ukraine with the Russian aggression, with Ukrainian forces pushing back. And that line has shifted. There are gains one way, gains another way. But what's really important is the strategic proposition that Putin will not succeed in what he's tried to achieve. Not only that, he's also tried to divide NATO. We're about to go to a NATO summit where the alliance is going to show greater unity, greater strength than in my memory. In Ukraine itself, here at this meeting of the G7, as well as at NATO, we will continue to do collectively everything we can to make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need in their hands to repel the Russian aggression.
Do you think the attack on Kyiv overnight and this morning was part of a direct provocation against the meeting of the G7?
We've seen sporadically, even ever since Putin lost the battle for Kyiv and had to shift his focus just to eastern and southern Ukraine, that they've occasionally launched missiles at a distance, basically to terrorize people. They struck an apartment building. There are reports that they struck a kindergarten. That has no purpose other than to try to terrorize Ukrainians.
The G7 just announced a new ban on Russian gold imports. The U.S. said that Western sanctions against Russia would devastate its economy, but that doesn't seem to be happening. The ruble is at its highest in years. Oil profits are soaring. When are these sanctions going to start having the effect that the West and President Biden has promised?
Well, they're already having a dramatic effect. Well, first, let's take gold, the thing that we're just announcing. That is the second most lucrative export that Russia has after energy. It's about $19 billion a year. And most of that is within the G7 countries. So cutting that off, denying access to about $19 billion of revenues a year, that's significant. But beyond that, Jake, everything that we've done from the start in imposing these unprecedented sanctions and the export controls is having a profound impact on Russia. Even as it gets oil revenues with higher prices, it's unable to spend them because of the export controls. It can't acquire what it needs to modernize its defense sector, to modernize its technology, to modernize its energy exploration, which means that over time, each of these areas is going to go in decline. Already, we're seeing predictions that the Russian economy will shrink by 8 to 15% next year. The ruble's being propped up artificially at great expense. 1,000 companies, major international companies, have left Russia. They had products that were still on the shelf when they left, but those supplies have now dwindled. Russians were no longer being able to buy what they're used to buying. The standard of living for Russians is dropping. All of this is having an effect immediately, but it's also having a cumulative effect. We've seen a brain drain from Russia. 200,000 Russians, among the most educated, working in some of the most important industries, have left. Many foreigners working in those same industries have left. All of this over time accumulates.
So there was a House resolution, bipartisan, in favor, expressing the desire that Brittany Griner be freed, the WNBA star who's now been detained in Russia for 129 days. American former Marine Paul Whelan's been there for almost 4 years. After the U.S. brought Trevor Reed home in a prisoner swap, my understanding is that there might be another prisoner swap in the works right now. CNN is reporting that there are discussions going on, and that you and President Biden and others are in favor of swap Griner and Whelan in exchange for Russian arms trafficker Victor Bout. Is that going to happen?
As a general proposition, Jake, I've got no higher priority than making sure that Americans who are being illegally detained in one way or another around the world come home. And that includes Paul Whelan, that includes Brittany Griner, that includes people in a number of other countries. In fact, I spoke to Brittany Griner's wife just a few days ago. I spoke to the families of many detained Americans.
They really want to talk to President Biden.
And
what's Putin up to?
Well, he's losing. And I think we've got to stand firm in the face of further threats and aggression. Frankly, I feel sorry for any Russian conscripted forces sent to Ukraine. What we know so far is well-trained forces, well-motivated forces with the right equipment are the people with the advantage and the success so far. So we can never underestimate Putin, but he's losing.
He is losing. And the battlefield reality he faces is, I think, irreversible. In other words, over the last 7 months, President Zelensky and Ukraine have mobilized vastly better than has Russia. The only question really is, when do you start to see not just individual soldiers or small units surrender, but when you start to see larger units crumble, crack, and perhaps actually collapse? And I think that will be coming.
What we might be at here is really at the precipice of
of really the collapse of the Russian army in Ukraine, a moral collapse.
I think that's really the biggest fear right now that I have, is that he would conduct an attack against a NATO supply center inside of a place like Poland. That would certainly raise the specter of a direct Russian attack against a NATO ally.
Pastor McFall, I was very pleased to read your optimistic assessment today about this war. You maintain that Vladimir Putin has already lost this war.
Yeah, and I use the word war precisely, not battle, Lawrence. And I think we need to go back to where we were talking to you 2 months ago, right? Remember, on the eve of this war, Putin said he was going to take all of Ukraine because they're not a real people. They're just Russians with accents. He was going to swallow it up whole. He failed with that objective. Number two, he said he was going to denazify the country. He's going to kill Zelensky or chase him out of the country, put in his own puppet regime. He failed with that objective. Three, destroy entirely the Ukrainian military. He failed with that objective. Four, he lost the Battle of Kyiv and lost the battle for other major cities so far. He failed with that objective. So now he's down to the fifth and final objective, which is defense of Donbass. If you listen to their language, I listen to Russian news every day, including Mr. Putin, they've changed their objectives. Now it's just the special military operation in defense of Donbass. So maybe they'll win the Battle of Donbass. I'm not prepared to know that. I think it'll be a very heated battle because of what you just were talking about in terms of our new military assistance. But the war, I think, overwhelmingly, the Ukrainians have already won.
Republican Institute, 97% of people worldwide believe President Vladimir Zelensky's troops will win the war.
The first and most important thing is to observe and recognize reality on the ground. And reality is that Ukraine is winning this war, Russia is losing this war, and Russia knows it. And our first important duty is to tell the truth to the people of Europe, to make sure that the people of Europe are properly informed. We have to tell to the people that Russia is failing militarily, it is failing politically, economically, and it is failing morally. Sanctions work. There are no more investments into Russia. Russia has no more access to our top technologies, and next year it will have no more revenues from gas and fossil fuels from us.
Can I ask you whether you agree with the former Minister of Defense of Ukraine, who wrote an article just recently in Foreign Affairs? I mean, it's really interesting. He says to win, Ukraine doesn't need a miracle. It just needs the West to increase its supply of sophisticated weaponry. Putin may respond by calling up additional soldiers, but poorly motivated forces can only delay a well-equipped Ukraine's eventual triumph. Do you agree with that?
I agree that Ukraine can win this war, and what we have seen over the last weeks is that the Ukrainian forces have made a significant gain. And the encouraging thing is that despite the challenges NATO allies are facing with increasing inflation, cost of living, energy prices, when we look at the opinion polls and the support across the lines, there's actually continued strong public support for providing support for Ukraine, and we need to be prepared for the long haul. And allies also realize that we are approaching winter, so it's also now a huge effort to provide winter clothing, tents, generators, diesel, to ensure that we are enabling the Ukrainians to be able to operate throughout the winter.